Well, good afternoon if you are in New York, as my guest and I are today. Good evening to people where it's evening. Good morning to those of you where it's morning. And special love, as always, to our loved ones in Ukraine. Be yourselves, stay strong. May music give you support and feeling and meaning. We are with you. My guest today is someone I've known for quite a while. His name is Ben Moore. He is a composer, an excellent composer, and he's a very special composer. And I don't say special as a euphemism. I say it because he is much loved by the singers for whom he composes. And I want to talk about composing for specific artists, for specific voices. But let's start with welcome, Ben. Good to see you.
It's great to be here, Fred. Great to see you.
Thank you.
You know, it's such an honor for me because I've known about you for so many years, and we didn't really meet officially early on, but I always saw your performances. Brian, my husband Brian, always pointed you out, and I've always thought of you as a Renaissance man. Do you like that term, Renaissance man?
I was a major in Renaissance history.
You were?
And yes, I mean, as a matter of fact, and by the way, your husband is Brian Ziegler, an outstanding musician and arts administrator in his own right. And he's appeared on the Metropolitan Opera Quiz, as I have. And I don't know if that's where I met him first, but he and I are contemporaries, as you and I are contemporaries, so you have more hair. And and so we've just known each other because I call it Planet Opera. In other words, we all live on this little planet, those of us who work in it. We don't always see one another, but we mostly know of one another. And I knew of you well before I met you. And yes, Renaissance. When I was a very small kid, I was already alerted to the Italian Renaissance. And my main fascination, people who know me know, is Italy and everything relating to Italy. But very specifically the concept of the Renaissance man or woman. And that term is often abused. It can be thought of as a dilettante. It can be thought of as someone who just never gets serious. And my view of it is that in modern times, we often point to specialization on things.
Yeah.
And I believe that we are complete humans, and our knowledge, our abilities, the way we interact with other people is based on drawing from many different sources,
Right.
And not in a dilettantish way, but going deep. So that someone like Michelangelo, and I'm not comparing myself to Michelangelo, but someone like Michelangelo saw drawing as a means of understanding his world. So whether he was thinking of a building, whether he was doing a poem, whether he was contemplating a face that he liked, whether he was contemplating an ugly face and trying to think how to bring the truth of that out, he began with disegno, with drawing. And that's a very Renaissance concept. There are other people like myself who believe in shoe leather. In other words, walking everywhere, observing, using the five senses to create knowledge in my head about things. I have many points of reference. People often ask, how come you remember so many things? And it's because I really activate my senses. I call this pleasure activism, and it's derived from this concept of total physical engagement with your environment, whether it's music, whether it's food. It's not about being a foodie and knowing the latest trend, but it's understanding why a particular herb or particular plant grows well in certain soil with certain salt in the air or not salt in the air, and so on. Being attuned to nature is very much a part of being a Renaissance person, I think. Another aspect of that is hearing everything, listening well. We hear everything, but we don't listen to everything. We smell everything, but we don't really savor and identify everything that we smell, which in a way is a good thing because there's some awful odors as well. But for example, wine. I have a very strong reference for wine because I use my nose and my mouth, but especially my nose, to identify wine. I feel a little bit like a border collie in my ability to sort of nose out everything. And I love using my senses. It could be overwhelming. My sense of touch. Um, I was talking to someone recently about a blind woman I know who goes to concerts and removes her shoes to feel the music more completely with her feet on the floor.
Wow.
And that's something that's remarkable. She sits close, even though obviously she cannot see the orchestra, because she feels the impact on her face. When she goes to the opera, she sits in the second row with her beautiful dog, who knows more about opera than any dog I know. And but she does that to feel everything on her face and in
Yes.
her body. And her
Yeah.
experience of an opera is that tactile experience, not just in the ears, but on her skin, on her face.
Mhm.
And so I just early on, I just was focused on the world and on seeing. And when I discovered very early this concept of the Renaissance man, I made it the template for my life. I don't claim to be a Renaissance man, but a model to follow and a
Yes.
way of living, which
Yeah.
does put me a lot at odds with modern times, I got to tell you.
I've been labeled Renaissance man too, and I didn't
Yeah.
like it. Didn't like it at first because, as you say, it can have a derogatory feeling. And if you dabble in all these different things, you don't do anything well. That could be a criticism. But I've always countered with, the specialist can be really excellent, but they can have blinders on and not really have the perception that you need to have a real rich take on whatever area you're delving into. So there are pros and cons, I admit.
And
But what,
also, whether it's politics, medicine, the practice of law, teaching,
yeah,
almost any endeavor, if we have an emotional understanding, or at least an emotional connection to the people we're dealing with and what they're experiencing, it's a very different thing than teaching, for example, mathematics. Mathematics can be taught very emotionally. I was terrible in math, and I had a teacher who somehow figured out how to connect with me.
mhm.
And she did that by going beyond the numbers, because the numbers made no sense to me, and they still don't.
And
But
but that's quite rare, isn't it? To
yeah,
have a teaching like that.
but when we're lucky to encounter people like that, people know the play and the film The Miracle Worker, about Annie Sullivan trying to teach Helen Keller to speak, to read, and so
Yeah.
on. I called Miss Engel the miracle worker because I was just impenetrable with concepts of mathematics. It doesn't speak to me in any way. I'm not against it. And I know people, I'm going to have a guest soon who adores mathematics and music. And he looks at Bruckner, for example, and sees music and math. And not just on the printed page, but somehow in his head, it's mathematics. Leonardo da Vinci was that way. And there are people for whom mathematics is a beautiful thing, and I don't begrudge them that. I don't understand that, basically.
Yeah, I'm with you. I'm like you.
So, given that we've gone in this direction, I'm going to ask you a question now I intended to ask you later on in our conversation. You are also a painter, in addition to being a composer.
Yeah.
Tony Bennett, the magnificent singer, is also a fantastic visual artist. And there are many people for whom they prefer his painting to his singing, although I love both. But they call on different aspects, I think, correct me if you think I'm wrong, of the creative process. And maybe you do both in part because they do call on different aspects. What came first, painting or music?
The painting really was my thing early on and for many years, and I majored in visual arts at college. So some people are surprised to hear that I didn't take my composition seriously till I was 30 years old. It's a long, it's a long delay before I delved into it. Before that, I was thinking about the visual arts, but then you may not know this, but in college, I fell in love with theater. And though I was thinking maybe of teaching art somewhere Renaissance man, I've got to start from the beginning, because my first
So
attention.
Ben, I'm gonna interrupt. The connection broke up a bit. So you said in
Oh, sorry.
college you fell in love with theater.
That's right. But I went to college as a pre-med student. So I took every pre-med course, physics, chemistry, biology, everything. And then abandoned that. And when I kind of fell in love with theater, I came to New York to be an actor, and I spent 6 years at that. Then I abandoned acting and decided I would teach art, since that had always been in my life. And simultaneously with that, I discovered musical composition. So I worked on them, and I have been basically juggling both ever since I was around 30 years old.
And when you say you discovered musical composition, did you discover it within you or outside of you?
It wasn't discovering it within me, really, because I was always making up music and fooling around since I was very, very young. I took piano lessons since I was 8 years old, and I was a bad student because I was always, just improvising all the time. But I never took it seriously. That's what happened when I was 30. And it was the man who I was partners with at the time. He twisted my arm to take it seriously. And then once I did, I kind of opened a whole window, and I became totally obsessed with it.
So you put a lot on the table there. I'm trying to think where to start. I'm going to start with the theater. Theater is a collaborative art. It has to be, whatever you do in it. Painting is collaborative if you're painting someone's portrait, but otherwise it's not collaborative.
Yeah.
Writing songs or an opera can be collaborative, or if you find a poem that was written decades ago or centuries ago, you're just collaborating with the words, but not with the person who wrote the words. And I know in my own working life, the choices I've made have been built largely on my preference to do things on my own, and wonder sometimes if my life would be different if I felt very collaborative. By that, I mean with a large group of people. I can collaborate with one or two other people, but somehow the mass process doesn't work for me. Did this gentleman you were with, or perhaps within yourself, come to a realization about yourself that pointed you toward one direction or the other after the collaborative period of theater?
It's so hard to understand looking back, because I don't want to reinvent the past. It's hard for me to really put my finger on what made the shift, just probably forces outside my knowledge, really. But I will say that theater was like a very unlikely choice for me to begin with, because I'm a very shy person, really. And some people who said, "You're really going into theater? You're not really the type to do that." But I just found it absolutely freeing. And it was really the first time in my life I had friends, really. I mean, really close friends in the theater, people like me. And it forced me to get outside of my head. So it was extremely therapeutic. And I think in a lot of ways, theater saved my life, because I in college, I was having, I don't want to get too personal, but I was having emotional issues that were put me right on the edge, let's just say. And with theater, I found the first time I was interacting with people, and I just felt better about myself. And so that was mainly the motivation for it, really. And I got more and more excited about it as I delved into it. But the frustrations of trying to get a job finally were really weighing on me. So I was ready for a change.
There's so much rejection in the theater.
Yes.
Even among many talented, caring people, because if someone goes up for a role and there are 30 people auditioning, only one will get it, and perhaps someone else will become the standby. Those 28 other people may have had wonderful qualities, but they just were not cast. And you have to develop a very thick skin to endure that.
I know. that's the double-edged sword of theater. It's probably the most therapeutic thing you can do because you use your whole body and your whole life. And you can work through so many emotional issues in doing your job. That's one side. On the other side, the rejection can be unbearable.
I was drawn to theater as a kid, and I did acting and speaking more than acting, but I did a lot of events where I would be present and speaking in front of an audience and liked it just fine. But I quickly had two things sort of push me away from it. One was that I didn't like reciting other people's lines and creating a character that was someone else. It didn't feel genuine to me. I didn't want to go and pretend and be something else. But number two, I was very taken with opera. And in theater, I began to explore the backstage life, which is to say scenery, costumes, lighting, technical production, all of that. And while it's fine to have a unit set of scenery in a play or a Broadway musical, what opera offered was so much more fascinating and thrilling in terms of the technical potential that's what drew me over to opera. Even though I knew I was not going to be a singer, I was not particularly interested in being an actor anymore. But there was a truth, an emotional truth in opera, and the ability to create beautiful things on the stage, not just what the singers do, but what surrounds them, that tell stories on many levels. That's what sort of brought me over to opera. By the time I was 16, I was working in opera.
That's amazing.
And not singing. Whatever little singing I had done, I was done with already. And although I did study with very good,
you grew up
in Manhattan, Brooklyn
yeah.
and Manhattan, yeah. And although I studied with two very fine singers, first one Herman Pry, the baritone, and the second one, also baritone, Tito Gobi, but with him I studied production, not singing. I studied interpretation, direction, things like that. And so that set me on a path for opera. And my first professional job was 1972 when I was 16. And so the mold was made, but then I sort of decided to find my way through that career. And the way you added painting or had painting, I have had writing, which is an even more solitary pursuit than the other things. And it suits me fine. I'm much happier talking to one individual who I care about, such as you, than being in a crowd. I don't.
You know that.
If I face an audience, it's fine. I'm not terrified. I enjoy it unless I don't know my material. But if I do know my material, I'm fine in front of an audience, but I don't really hear the applause because my satisfaction comes in the doing.
You're right.
Approbation is not something I seek or have ever sought. I know that for many people, it's a big part of that, and that's fine. But I came to understand that one can have a public life without having to share everything about yourself and saving yourself for the work. And so I want to get back to you in that yourself in the work as a painter is probably, and correct me if I'm wrong, different from yourself as a composer.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that because usually I get the question, how are the two art forms related and how do they intersect? But for me, they really don't really intersect. They're very different parts of the brain, I guess. And I don't claim to understand. I don't think anyone really does actually understand it, but it's a very separate pursuit. And I often say that if I'm exhausted working on a musical piece, I'll still have energy for the visual side because it's just a whole different pursuit. And if I'm pressed to say if there are similarities, I can say that in the process of putting them together, you can find parallels. So just the emotional process of hitting a brick wall and having to step back and going back in, and using your subconscious or letting your subconscious guide you at times, and other times being very strict with yourself. But that I think is true for any art form. And they're all quite different. And I totally admit that some artists like Kandinsky will say that he absolutely feels this very intimate connection. He experienced synesthesia. That's certainly not me,
Yeah.
but I'm fascinated with that when it happens.
Arnold Schoenberg was an accomplished painter.
That's right. And Kandinsky and Schoenberg were friends, and
Yeah.
they envied each other, and they shared a lot of their philosophical ideas. Yeah.
I don't think I'm pushing a metaphor too far to use the word colors, that there are colors in music, whether it's the key signature, whether it's the way a note is sung or played on an instrument,
Sure.
and obviously colors and textures and subtleties and shades and shadows in painting and drawing and visual arts. Do you, and if you don't, just tell me, do you connect this concept of colors when you write music in a way that relates to your painting, or is it a whole other mindset of colors than the colors in your painting?
It's a whole other set, but I will borrow, like we all do, borrow words from different disciplines and different realms, because when you're talking about art of any kind, it's very hard to find a way to describe it. So you just kind of leap into those other disciplines, but that's about the extent of it, really.
Do you see, can you see in painting things like major and minor and crescendo and pizzicato and no, pointillism?
No, I really don't. It's a different hat altogether. Yeah, I know that's not usually the answer people like, but that's how I experience it.
You know, I realized, Ben, that I don't think I did my standard introduction to Adagio because I was so eager to talk to you. Welcome to Fred Plotkin on Fridays on Adagio, the place where classical music happens. Adagio is a video and audio streaming platform dedicated to supporting artists and to making classical music and opera available to music lovers all around the world. Done. Because I was so eager to talk to you that
Adagio is a great platform, and congrats on this series. It's fantastic.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. So when you have worked on an opera, and by the way, you wrote a really wonderful opera that I went to the premiere of in Florida, Palm Beach Opera 2015, Enemies, a Love Story. Talk about the inspiration for that. I know the origin of it. I know the story, but talk about how you came to do that, and were you commissioned? Were you inspired? How did that happen?
Yeah, sure. When I got into music, writing down music early on in my career, it was mostly cabaret musical theater pieces that I was writing. And then when I met Brian, who was a wonderful pianist for lots of singers, it kind of opened the door to art song for me and all kinds of specialty material that I was writing. And then it began to percolate slowly in my 40s that, you know, I could write an opera. And I grew up with opera, with my parents being opera fanatics, and I've loved it and listened to it for so long. I never thought that I had the qualifications to write an opera, really. But then it was in the back of my mind for several years, and I had lunch with a guy named Sandy Fisher. Do you know who I'm talking about?
Yes.
He was the producer. He was the head of Berkshire Opera upstate, or no, in Massachusetts.
Massachusetts, yeah.
Yeah, and he's been a producer, and he's had his hands in a lot of artistic opera things. And so he was saying, this is how it came about. He was just lamenting that there weren't enough new operas that were written in a mode that he really loved, which was very melodic, very accessible, but sophisticated at the same time. And I said, why can't there be a dramatic, very serious dramatic story that's not told with modernist dissonance, but with more melodic music, And I said to him, well, that's kind of what I aspire to do as well. And one thing led to another, and he sponsored me to write the opera. I don't know if you knew that.
No.
And he did for several years. And I sent it around. After a couple of workshops, I sent it around. One thing led to another, and Palm Beach Opera was the first to premiere it. Sandy was part of the choice of subject matter, and Nama Sandra, who came on as the librettist, that came a little bit into the process. But the first readings were at Sandy's apartment, and then at Juilliard, where Sandy helped sponsor those events as well. It would never have happened without his help, because there's so many expenses along the way.
And how did you pick Enemies, a Love Story? I'm not naming the author or anything. I want you to talk about that. I know who wrote it, and people who live on 86th Street in New York City know who wrote it, because the author's name is on the street sign below West 86th Street.
Although that was his home for a long time, and it's Isaac Bashevis Singer, who was the great Yiddish writer from Poland, who came to the United States and wrote in English and had translators, and won the Nobel Prize, et cetera, et cetera. This was a story about refugees from the Holocaust who came to New York. It's 3 years after the war. It tells a story about one man, Herman Broder, and how he adapts to the city. I honestly was searching. I was just fascinated with immigration and refugees and that experience, because I thought there's so much intense emotion and so many possibilities around that experience. So I was just searching everywhere for a story. And it was very hard to find something that was available and something that really turned me on. This was something that came up. I can't tell you exactly. I don't know if Sandy suggested it. It wasn't something I leapt at first because of, I don't come from the Jewish world, although I have a very dear aunt that played a big part in my upbringing, who was married to my father's brother, my Aunt Trudy, and she was a Holocaust survivor. And so the stories that she told were extremely powerful to me. She had a certain campaign, a certain period where she talked to high schools about how her entire extended family was murdered, and she and her sister escaped just before. It just haunted me my whole life, and I chose the subject. I chose the book, and once I got started on it, there was no turning back. I had many doubts along the way. I said, I don't think I can make this work. But with Nama and Sandy and Brian all kind of say, keep going, keep going. It finally came together.
Give the outlines of the story. I'm not doing it because I know it, but you're the composer, so I want you to talk about how you came to the story, because I think it's a magnificent story. It worked beautifully as a novella, beautifully as a film, and beautifully as an opera.
So give my story about how it all started, or
no, the story as told in the opera.
Oh, sure, yeah. So we have this man, Herman Broder, who is a writer, a renowned intellectual in Poland, in the novel. And the backstory before the curtain opens, or before the novel opens, is that he survived the war as a Jewish intellectual, not by surviving the camps, but by being hidden in a hayloft by his family's own servant, really, her name being Jadwiga. She hid him in her father's hayloft for 3 years during the war. He believed that his wife and his 2 children must have been killed. In fact, he was told by eyewitnesses that they saw them gunned down outside their home in another part of Poland. Now, these are not wild inventions, as you know. These are things that happened over and over again during the war. And I think Singer just compiled so many firsthand stories from his own family and from other families into this very intricate story. But the event that we know has played out many, many times is the centerpiece of this story, which is that after 3 years being married to this woman who saved him, he gets a message that his wife that he thought was dead is actually alive. And he goes to an apartment on the Lower East Side, and to his astonishment, there she is, Tamara, his wife. And I'm laughing because it's a comic take on this. It's so tragic and yet absolutely hilarious, because how could this actually happen? But it does. And he is a very bumbling, fumbling fool on one hand, and a brilliant wise man on the other. And everything he does just makes the situation worse and worse and worse. And he's in love with this other woman who lives in the Bronx. And there's Jadwiga and there's Tamara. And instead of just coming clean, he just lies and lies and lies, digs, digs, digs. And at the end, you have to stick around, but he leaves them all at the end,
Yeah.
at the very last minute.
So you bring to mind in recounting this, here's an idea that for an opera you're going to write. There's a film with Cary Grant, Irene Dunne, and I believe Gail Henry, but we'd have to check,
Yeah.
called My Favorite Wife.
Oh,
And
yeah.
it's a similar thing in which Cary Grant has learned that his beloved wife has died, and on a safari or something like that, or bear hunt, I think in Alaska, something where she's out in nature.
Mhm.
And he meets another woman. He's a lawyer, and he goes to court and asks the judge to annul his first marriage, and they will hold a funeral, and he's going to marry Gail Henry. And then, of course, Irene Dunne appears, and her children don't recognize her, but the dog knows her. And the dog becomes a conduit in the film for recognition. It's a very funny thing. And Cary Grant's mother recognizes her eventually. And Cary Grant doesn't believe it, and he does these wonderful Cary Grant double takes.
Yeah.
And then he starts behaving strangely with the woman he's about to marry. It is a very funny film with a classic setup. And
I'm sure I've seen parts of it, but I should check it out again.
I mean, I never thought of this until this moment, and you triggered that in me, that would make a very funny comic opera, I think. And a chamber opera in that you don't need a huge cast.
Sure.
You don't need many settings, but it could be very, very funny. And frankly, although one could do it with a man and two women, it could be done with any combination of people that you wish. My favorite wife / husband, whatever you want can be done. Maybe it can be done different ways in different productions, even where the opera is the same, the music is the same, and they'll have names like Pat, Chris, and Sydney.
Yeah. Yeah, but how do you make it work for different sexes? I don't know, but it could be done.
It could be done, and it's not that it has to be done. That was just a director's gimmick I came up with. But even if you did it in the traditional way that the film did it, we need more opera comedies right now. And you have a gift for comic writing in music. I'm sure I'm not the first person who's alerted you to that. How did you come to discover that? Because tragedy is easy, comedy is hard, they say.
Yeah. I never thought I had any knack for it at all. And really, well, the first opera singer of any note to sing my music was Jerry Hadley. And we worked together on a project. It didn't involve comedy per se, but had some comedic elements.
For people who don't know, he was a wonderful American tenor.
Yes. And it was a musical theater piece that we were working on together before he died. And tragically, and I'm still not over it. But when Brian started playing for Deborah Voigt, he was working.
Wonderful American surprise.
Yes, of course, right. He was working with her, and I was kind of saying, "Gee, you're working with Deborah Voigt, the amazing singer. Do you think she would look at some music that I've written?" And so he was kind of fishing around with her because he was a young pianist and he didn't want to push anything on anybody at that point. He wanted to protect his collaborations, of course. But he did say that all she keeps saying is, "I wish I had a comedy song to do as an encore." Because I guess some other singers had success with comedy songs. So I said, I've never written a comedy song, but I will try to do something for Debbie and just do it on spec, see how funny I can make it, and then see if she likes it. And so I wrote this piece called Wagner Rolls. Did you ever hear her perform it?
Yes, sure.
Yes.
Oh, goodness.
That was the first time. That was the first time. And I looked at a lot of other comedy pieces. I didn't know I had any knack for it, but what I did have was a lot of knowledge about Wagner and all the things that you could trip you up. And it turns out that's all you really need. It's the key that no one tells you about. But to write something funny, all you have to do is know something really well, and just use your memory and say, okay, well, that's something you can make a joke out of. and then just make it rhyme and you're on your way.
So did you write the words as well as the music?
Yeah, I write all the words for these
And
comedies.
which came or comes first? In this song, which came first? Did
Well,
you, how did it work?
for me, it's almost always music first. And you might surprise you because something like comedy song, you think it has to have, you have to have the text first. But for me, the most important thing is the tune. And I had this kind of nice soft shoe tune in my head.
Mhm.
And then I fit the words to that. But that doesn't mean that was just the chorus of it, you know.
Yeah.
Then there were a lot of parts where I could, more recitative parts where I could fit in words at whatever pace I wanted to, really.
And it's a wonderful song. And then you started doing more for Debbie Voigt, but also for other really magnificent American artists. And I think maybe a couple who are not American, but you write a lot in the American idiom, if I can use such a broad term.
That's right. Yeah. So I said, well, if that went well, I'll try to write for my other favorite singer at the time, which was Susan Graham, and that worked out. This song called "Sexy Lady," and then the Opera Guild, Met Opera Guild, heard some of them and started asking me to write comedy songs for their luncheons that honored various folks. So I wrote one for Kiri Takano and Montserrat Caballé, and
together, or you wrote separate songs?
Separate songs for them, yeah.
Because the duet of Kiri Takano and Montserrat Caballé.
No, but Federico von Stade sang the song for Kiri.
Yeah.
The jokes were about Kiri.
Yeah, I heard that one too. Yeah.
and then Debbie sang the song for Montserrat Caballé.
Yeah.
And then someone said you should really make a book of these songs. So then I wrote a song about "I'm Glad I'm Not a Tenor," which was just on spec. And a lot of people have done that, but no big names really. And then Brian said, but wait a minute, I'm the pianist. You should write one about the pianist. So I wrote a song called "Content to Be Behind Me," and Debbie sang that. So
that's komische Liederbuch. But have you taught in conservatories and so on? I'm asking specifically because this is the kind of music that I would want to train young artists on, because they have to know what they're singing about. They have to know how to be expressive in the words in addition to the music. And comedy is hard. I wasn't joking when I said that. And
I'm glad you said that, because I have taught composition students in various places, in the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, and then Pepperdine University, and at the Walnut Hills School for the high school level. And I often bring up, if you really want to learn about composition, you should write a comedy song, because it's very demanding. Because if you don't get laughs, then it's not working, and you get that instant feedback. And so you work harder. And the point is, both musically and lyrically, you have to have a setup and a payoff. And I found that really helped me in my serious music, because if you can set up musically and lyrically a joke, you can apply that to serious music. I don't know if that makes sense, but
it does.
Yeah.
So did the Jewish students at Hebrew University have a different sense of humor than the students at Pepperdine?
They were very quiet. I don't know why they're very quiet. And then afterwards, they all talked to me a lot. But
that's true.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I've experienced that.
I was surprised. I didn't know why that was. But then after the class, they were all very chatty and
yeah. Well, this is also a generational thing. Mm-hmm. In our years when we went to school, we spoke up. We felt empowered to speak up. Yeah. Nowadays, a lot of students, and I say this with regret when I teach, don't want to look foolish in front of their classmates.
Yeah.
And it's more in some countries than other countries. It's more in some schools than other schools. And I've had the situation where during the class, which is 45 minutes, there are no questions. And then when it's time for me to go, I have to stay another hour to answer all the questions that they won't ask in the class.
Yeah, but I would have thought the opposite, that young people today would be more free to do that, but some
Not in my experience. Maybe
Yeah.
yours is different. But did you notice anything in the actual music that was different or the same with the students of Hebrew University and Pepperdine, which is in Southern California?
Well, actually, in Hebrew University, I was just doing a master class.
Okay.
And talking to the class. At Pepperdine, I worked with everybody in separate sessions.
Yeah.
It was very, very informative, with great variety. I was really thrilled that there was such a variety of what the students were doing, because I've read a lot of memoirs of composers and so forth, and there was a stranglehold for a long time, and I don't think it's any secret. Certain academic tastes that most composers had to adhere to, but it's
If they wanted to get ahead.
yeah.
Yeah.
And I feel that has definitely changed from my experience, at least. Yeah, and I think that's positive.
I think, especially for people listening to us from outside the United States, a lot of people don't acknowledge something that I contend all the time, that the United States is now or North America is now the world center of new opera. And yes, a lot is produced in Europe, of course, in places like Finland and Germany and Austria and France, and to a lesser degree, England and Italy. But in terms of being an absolute engine of new opera,
Yeah,
it's happening here.
it really is. Yeah.
And do you encounter students who are eager and ambitious to go into opera as composers?
Well, don't get me wrong, I haven't had that much experience working with composers, mostly with singers singing my songs. That's my main teaching thing. Although I'm really very eager to teach composers, and I'm actually looking for more opportunities to do that. But I've had people write me often, not often, but occasionally, saying, I'm starting this new opera. Can you mentor me in some way? Or can I send you some parts of the score? Do you have any advice for me? So it was, to me, it was very exciting to start off and say, wow, I'm writing an opera. It's the most, it's the richest of all art forms, I really feel still.
Yep.
So it's not surprising. Even people who don't even know that much about classical music have this excitement around the form. So it doesn't surprise me that it's something that drives people.
But I think also we're seeing a generation of librettists who are coming forth with ideas, and they're very talented. I guess the most famous one of the Americans is Mark Campbell,
Yes.
who I refer to as our Metastasio because he seems to have a new libretto every week, in addition to traveling to new productions and living at the beach where he does with his dachshund, and somehow producing all of this work and traveling the world to see it done, and then sponsoring grants for librettists and so on. And so he's a wonderful figure. He was on the show in December of 2020, I think. Yeah.
Okay. Well, that's right after we worked together. We worked together in 19. That's right.
And what did you work on with him?
We had a commission for a song cycle by the London Song Festival. And that was performed, well, it was delayed in the pandemic, but it was performed toward last year, yeah.
Mm-hmm. So you raised something that touched not a nerve, but it alerted something in me that I think you're a good person to ask about that. I often am contacted by people, young people, but not only young people, seeking mentorship, seeking advice, seeking help, and so on. The day only has 24 hours. We have a certain amount of stamina. I need, and I think you do too, a certain amount of downtime to simply free float and summon the muse, and then sit down at the computer or the canvas or whatever, or the kitchen in my case, and create.
Right.
And but we do want to help. How do you balance this desire to help with the need, and it's also financial, it's not simply creative, to do your own stuff?
Yeah, it's it wrenches my heart, really, because when I was much younger, I was soliciting people for their advice and sometimes never heard back. And I felt a little, not angry or put off, but just a little disappointed at the time. And I would just love to pay that forward, but I really know. And I'm so flattered when someone asks me something like that too. I never thought I'd be in this position. So I really want to follow through and I really try. But even as we speak, there's an email that from 2 weeks ago that I really should answer, but it's going to take some thought. And I just haven't had the time yet. So I'm gonna try to get to it.
Well, here's a good editing device. If someone says they want to pick your brain, that goes into the trash heap. I don't like the sound of having my brain picked.
No. I mean, how do you handle it? Do you say, I'm super busy, I'd love to help you, but I can't? I mean,
I make appointments. What I do is, if the person strikes me as a serious person, I will say in all candor, I don't have a slot where I can devote my focus and energy to you for 2.5 months. Can we make an appointment at that time? And if we can, I will keep my end of the appointment. Mm-hmm. And people who say, no, I need to know right now, I'll say, well, sorry, I can't help you. But if they say, thank you, yes, then I do help them.
Yeah, that's smart.
But often I become deeply involved with the work and the questions that these people have, and it occupies my mind. There is frankly a person who's written to me for advice, and he's given me a week. But I've been thinking very seriously about what he wants to know, because it's opera related and it's something I can help him with. But it has occupied a lot of my time, and I have had to put down the pad where I'm making notes for him and just push it away. And then I'll get back to it because he and I have an appointment in a week, and then I will address it. But I learned a long time ago, as a mostly self-employed person, that one has to budget one's time, and one has to budget for rest. One has to budget for creative empty space. One has to budget for emergencies that crop up. And I stick to a very tight schedule. Part of why I like to do Fred Plotkin on Fridays is that I know where I am. It's an appointment. In effect, it's a different person all the time. But I began this during the early times of the pandemic, where we were all stuck behind our screens. And even now, yes, we certainly have COVID among us, and we have to take it seriously and get booster shots. But I don't have to do it anymore. But I do it because for me, it's a great creative outlet and stimulus. In that the people I have joined me back in October, I had Leif Ove Ansnes, the wonderful Norwegian pianist. I've wanted to speak to him my whole life. Yeah. And frankly, this program became the opportunity, after 2 years of trying to get him, because he's very busy, of getting him. And it was life-changing for me. And I've had experiences of talking to people I have never interacted with, where it becomes life-changing. People, friends such as you, it's wonderful to be with you, but there is a history. Yeah. But when I meet someone for the first time who I look to as a model, as someone who inspires me, it's an incredibly nourishing thing for me. Yeah,
and it can feed your writing and other pursuits.
It absolutely does. Yeah. What Leif Ove Ansnes gave me to think about, I will send you the link. Just in terms of pedaling things on the piano, I'm not a pianist, but the way he described his physical relationship to the piano was a beautiful thing and made me understand more about what goes into playing the piano as well as someone like that does. Yeah. So I decided that during the pandemic, when we couldn't go out, to create this series as a document of creativity in the world. And I'm glad I did it. And while I don't have to anymore because our lives have changed, I continue to do it because it's a creative thing for me. And I get to talk in detail and not in a quick way at a theater lobby with people like you who do inspire me. And you know that. I think you've known that for a while. You have created 2 youth operas. What's a youth opera?
Well, for me, it's operas that are intended to be performed by young people for an audience of young people. It's true there might be different definitions, but that was our assignment from Glimmerglass Festival, and that's what we created. Me and the librettist Kelly Work. Yeah.
Talk about your 2 youth operas.
Have you seen a production of it?
I have not, unfortunately.
That's okay. That's okay. The first one was Odyssey, based on Homer's The Odyssey. It was just 1 hour, and the original production was just with piano and young voices and 2 of their young artists up there. It was the very first youth opera that Francesca Zambello commissioned, and now they've been going every year since then. I think ours premiered in 2015, I think. And then 2 years later, she had Kelly and I back to do a version of Robin Hood. It was similar to comedy songs being very, very instructive because of the demands. Youth operas have great demands also that really make you up your game, because young people have shorter attentions, and you can't mess around. You've got to just keep them engaged and keep them excited. And that was really helpful to me.
So when you say young voices, are they teenagers? Are they pre-puberty, and therefore the voice is not changed?
Yeah, a few
in the boys,
a few boy sopranos, and I would say the group that she has up there were everything from 5 years old to 18 years old. So it's interesting. I mean, you have the soprano section. Basically, it was 3-part harmony for the most part, because you don't have enough voices that are baritone. You certainly don't have enough to divide into tenors. So I started out with a three-part harmony, but then in subsequent productions, I revised it to 4-part harmony. It got revised many times. It was done at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and I wrote a whole prelude where images from the museum were broadcast, and then a whole postlude that featured the chorus of the New York City youth chorus. I've lost the proper name for that, but the youth chorus of New York City, I think it's called.
Yeah.
So,
which I was in as a kid.
oh, were you really? Yeah.
Yeah.
Francisco Nunez is now.
Right.
Yeah.
I think then it was called the All City Chorus, but it's the same institution.
Yeah.
So when you write for your adult opera singers, you probably write on their voice and their character and their humor and such. When you write a youth opera, are you writing roles and then you find the right singer, or do you write on the voices and personalities of particular very young artists?
So I didn't have the opportunity to write for any particular singers, because we just had to pull it together, and then auditions were just a month or 2 before the show. So I was writing with just bearing in mind they would probably be 16 or 17 years old, the main characters, and then 2 young artists I could write. For instance, the siren song in Odyssey, I knew that I was going to have a wonderful high soprano, so I had her up on a high C, and I wanted to show the kids what voices could do, and we had a baritone that could really show the best part of the baritone voice. So they had this exciting opportunity to be part of an opera where they could really perform and do their best, but then be surrounded by these professional opera singers. Yeah.
Did you have a Cyclops?
The Cyclops was a big puppet. It was fantastic.
Yeah. Did the puppet have a voice? I'm interested in what vocal category is the Cyclops?
Yeah. In our version, the Cyclops was a speaking role.
In the key of I.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that was a fun part. Yeah.
I can imagine.
Mm-hmm.
I know that you've taught, we're going back to painting, at the Guggenheim Museum and at the Morgan Library.
Yeah.
So we were talking about teaching music, now talk about teaching painting and visual arts.
Yeah, I mean, before that, I was teaching a continuing ed course at Marymount College, teaching adults in painting. And I've taught at the Chautauqua Institute painting and music. So it's a challenge. It's challenging to teach, because the first step is to really get to know who you're teaching, where they're coming from. And that's a kind of a learning process that you go through class by class. But I've found the more I've taught in the visual arts that there are some very fundamental things that you can give them. And the main thing is the love for the art form. And I just find that that's really that's the most powerful thing you can do. And so I was doing little lectures before my classes and just sharing, and not talking to them, but just sharing my enthusiasm for the artists that I really love. And that gets them going. And then when you go on one-on-one with artists as they're working, then you can give them some technical tips that can help them, because there's there's always a technical side, and just a few technical tricks can give them a lot of information. But it's the inspiration. It's an obvious thing to say, but it's the feeling of excitement that matters most.
One of my dearest friends, an Italian from Milan, who has lived in America since he's about 24, so his whole adult life he's our contemporary, recently revealed something about himself to me that I never knew. He's a wonderful journalist. His English is fantastic. He's a filmmaker. He does reportage. He's a magnificent drawer, designer, really fantastic. And he showed me some of his work. And apparently it's not that he was keeping it within himself for decades, but it's something that he was alerted to recently about himself. And the quality of his work is astonishing, not because he's not a great person, he is, but just because he never, ever showed that interest. He worked in storytelling, whether journalism, filmmaking, and so on. And it just stunned me and has made me think in a very positive way about what people of all ages can still do. And it's not that opportunity is suddenly shut down just because we are 85. He's not 85, but we're 85 or whatever. And the creativity can continue.
I often say that people are discouraged because there are not many examples in history of someone pulling out first-rate work late in life in any discipline. But I think that is a vicious circle, because you're told and you're meant to believe that it's too late to rediscover or to kindle some new artistic pursuit. But there are examples, and they disprove that idea. There certainly are examples where people have done exceptional work in fields that they either did when they were very young and found again, or found for the first time.
Then there are the people such as Giuseppe Verdi and Titian, who worked to very old age, and Michelangelo, and continued to do great work, evolving, changing, and so on. But I think an argument could be made that Verdi's, some of his greatest work came at the very end of his life.
Absolutely.
Not to knock what came before, which is magnificent. Had he just written Rigoletto, Traviata, Trovatore, and Aida, he'd be very famous.
That's true. But on the other hand, if he died at the age Mozart died, he wouldn't be famous either. But
he would have written Nabucco and I Lombardi, and
he wouldn't be so famous, really.
Yeah, it's true.
But he had a long life, and he did unbelievable work towards the end, and I think probably his best work.
So you've awakened the thought in me that I don't talk about very often, but I teach music to a lot of people, audiences. I don't teach musicians, although I coach singers in interpretation, but I don't teach them how to sing. But I teach audiences and the public everywhere, including on Adagio. And I, a long time ago, discovered that using visual arts to teach music is very beneficial, because sometimes people see things in paintings and sculpture and such that makes a direct translation to the music. It happens that I go in the other direction, that I look at paintings and I hear music, rather than I look at rather than using paintings to teach music. But my big three that I always start with are Bach, Beethoven, and Mozart. Bach, Leonardo da Vinci,
Okay.
Beethoven, Michelangelo, Mozart, Raphael. And when I teach high Renaissance art and I play their music, it's not that Bach was inspired by Leonardo, although who knows,
Yeah.
but it's that if you connect to what's happening in Bach, you can connect to what's happening in Leonardo. If, in my case particularly, you connect to what's happening in Michelangelo, you can connect to what's happening in Beethoven, a certain kind of utopianism, a certain kind of rage and anger. If you connect to the sublime beauty and emotional specificity in Mozart, you do in Raphael.
Yeah, I can see that. I can see that. And as you know, I don't usually make those connections.
Right.
And something in me resists making those connections. So, but I totally hear what you're saying. I can see that.
And I use Delacroix to teach Berlioz.
Oh, yeah.
And it's interesting the degree to which one can go. I don't want to exaggerate it, and I don't have to pair every painter, every artist with every composer. For example, I don't see Klimt and Mahler, although they were often associated in people's mindsets because they were contemporaries and so forth.
Right.
But I don't necessarily see that.
Yeah.
But in certain cases, what the music tells me and what the art tells me, rather than the biographies of the artists.
Yes, yes. Yeah.
And they don't have to be from the same country, obviously, because Beethoven and Michelangelo were not from the same country.
Right. Or the same era, obviously.
Or the same era. And I don't think that, and in fact, I can't think of many composers who lived in the same era as the paintings, the painters that I would connect them with. It's about an emotional connection.
Yes, yeah.
I use Paolo Veronese when I teach stagecraft, for example. So it's not teaching a composer, but the visual components in a Veronese painting, to me, could be a stage set. And I do that a lot. You were talking before about Pepperdine in California, and it brought to mind that some of the best opera tech students I ever taught were not in opera at all. They were at Caltech, California Institute of Technology in Pasadena, California. And I decided to hand them Verdi's Otello to work on. And the class would create a production. They didn't know the music, but they had a sense of the story, and I played the music for them. And over the course of 2 weeks, we collectively built an opera production. Most of them had never looked at costumes or thought about lighting and so on. And because these kids are so brilliant at Caltech, we were able to bring forth what I found to be a very credible, doable opera production, where you would have, the ship arrive and the plank come down and Otello come out, a salvo, and all that. But then the tender scenes and moving the sets. And basically they built one kind of hill, and the hill would flatten to become the palace. It would rise to become Gianni La Notte dance at the end of the first act. It would form the ship. It became flat for the final scene where Otello kills Desdemona. And they had Venetian and Cypriot columns coming around. It was just an amazing experience for me to hand music and text to people who didn't work with music and text and see what they could create.
That's always interesting. It reminds me of when during my process of writing music, I ask experts advice, like Brian, for instance, and I value his advice very, very much. But I value the advice of and I don't know how to call them, but people who are not necessarily into classical music or new to classical music, people who love music but not necessarily know anything about it, or the kind of music I'm writing, whatever that is. Their advice is very important to me, and they're always apologizing. Well, why are you asking me? I don't know. But I love that part at the end, or something like this, or what's going on in the middle. It's just so useful to me. It's a fresh perspective, and they're unedited as well.
Right. Well, you were saying unedited, and I was thinking these are what I would call useful editors, because they are not professional editors, they don't necessarily bring a background of knowing the art form, but they bring a background of being human beings.
That's right. Yeah.
Who emotionally respond.
Yeah. And your tech students, by the same token, they're thinking, well, this seems appropriate to me. I don't know if it's been done before. I don't know if it's been criticized in the past or whatever. They're just doing what they.
And I simply brought in a recording, and we sat, and they would listen to the music, and I would say, here's the ship. Here arrives the chorus.
Mm-hmm.
Here is a table. And I didn't say anything of where to put the table, what the table should look like, what the color of the table was. But they began listening to the music and noting on their pads that here is the table. And there's a reason the table has to be there. Here is what is known in French as a prie-dieu. In other words, a kneeling place to pray to God. Because Verdi, in his notes in the last act, very specifically calls for prie-dieu, that Desdemona will kneel at to pray for the last time in her Ave Maria piena di grazia. And what they designed, because they were not necessarily attached to the look of the Renaissance, was something that, frankly, I loved. It was a transparent prie-dieu, because in their minds, we should see Desdemona kneeling rather than just see her shoulders up with her praying. And I asked about that, and I said, well, what color will her costume be? Because she's going to bed. Will it be white? No, it will be black. And I'd never thought of Desdemona wearing black in her death. But if you think about it, yes, actually, with her blonde or reddish hair.
Yeah.
And seeing her dress in black for the moment that will be her death, where she knows it, was incredible. I'm getting goosebumps thinking about it. It was incredibly compelling. And their view that we should see it as she prays was their understanding of the drama through the music and the words.
Oh, that's powerful.
Rather than my dictating to them what the prie-dieu should look like. Mm-hmm. And this, if you have very smart, receptive people, and you don't have to be smart, but you have to be open and receptive, mm-hmm. is a wonderful teaching experience for the teacher.
That's right.
I mean, they gave me more in those 2 weeks in Pasadena than I think they got a lot out of me, but I don't think any of them went into opera, but that was not the point.
Right.
It was about imagination.
Absolutely. Yeah. That's great.
And I don't know if we can teach imagination, but we can awaken imagination.
I think that's right. We can get them excited. We can get them, we can show them how you're excited.
Yeah.
Personally, that I find works, because you can't get them interested in something you're not interested in. And then you just open those windows and see where they take it.
So you, as I've asked a lot of my guests to do, have selected wonderful music for Idagio listeners to go to, and they will be attached to this page. I'll name some. I'm going to start with the one that seems natural to me, the complete songs of Samuel Barber.
Yeah.
How come?
It's, my mother was a mezzo-soprano. I don't know if you know that. And she and my father was an amateur baritone. My father ran an opera company in Utica, New York. And, I was surrounded by classical music and art song. My mother loved Samuel Barber. She was singing "Must the Winter Come So Soon" when I was just a child, and she
and in Utica, New York, the winter comes in September.
It does. It comes very soon. And I never thought of that.
That's why she was singing.
That's right. And "Sure on This Shining Night" and the Hermit songs, and they just got inside my bloodstream, and I love them very much. So in fact, all my choices are choices, except maybe for the Mozart, which I came to a little later. They're all things that introduced me when I was very young. And
so the Mozart Concerto for Clarinet in A Major.
Yeah, with that one, I came to a little later, because to be totally honest, Wagner and Mozart I came to adore, but a little later in my life.
Mozart is tough.
Mozart's really tough. Yeah.
People think that Mozart, start a kid with Mozart, he'll become a genius and that's it. No, Mozart is hard.
It's hard.
Mozart is magnificent, but it is hard.
Didn't grab me until I was well into my 20s.
I grew up with that concerto because the instrument I studied was the clarinet.
Oh,
so I happen to know that Mozart developed a passion for the clarinet in 1790, because the modern clarinet, as we know it, was developed in 1790, and the leading player was Johann Stadler, maybe it's Stedler. I don't know if there's an umlaut over the A. And when Mozart encountered the clarinet, he loved it, and he created the concerto, a quintet. In La Clemenza di Tito that he wrote in 1791, the clarinet is very prominent. He took his 40th symphony and took oboe parts and other wind parts and rewrote them for the clarinet. And so he had this late surge, because he died in 1791, December 5th, of passion and inspiration from the clarinet.
Yeah, see, I didn't even know that history.
You chose Chopin's Ballade No. 1 as played by Evgeny Kissin, very specifically. Is it the music? Is it the pianist? Is it both?
I listened to all the ones that were on the Adagio site, and that one fit my imagination the best of how I feel it should go. But my mother was a wonderful pianist. She used to play that all the time. And I used to just watch her and say, ask her to play it again. And I used to just swoon to that music. And honestly, no one really plays it the way, and I've worked on it, of course, myself, and no one plays it to my total satisfaction, because I have very specific ideas about how I think it should go. There's a part where the tune comes back and Chopin writes fortissimo with accents. No one ever plays it strongly enough for me. It's true, it's low, but he wanted it really powerful there. And of course, when I play it, I bang, which you shouldn't do. But I hate it when you have this build up and not quite fulfillment, when the big tune comes back. So that's just me and my pet peeve, but I still.
I'm going to commend a book to you if you haven't read it, called Chasing Chopin by Annick Lafarge. She was my guest a couple of years ago in October of 2020, I think. And it's a wonderful book, well written, about her relationship to one Chopin piece, but also her pursuit of Chopin and coming to understand him through this music, and what she learned about him specifically through the window of this particular piece. And it's a wonderful book.
The ballade itself.
No, it's not the ballade, it's another work.
Okay.
I'm not saying it intentionally, because I don't want people to say, well, I don't like that work, so I'm not reading the book. Chasing Chopin. In my bailiwick, Puccini, Madama Butterfly, specifically the Scotto Domingo recording, and especially the duet Viene la Sera at the end of the first act. Again, is it the opera? Is it the two singers?
It's mainly the opera. My mother would play Suzuki when I was like 6 years old, and the production. They used to have rehearsals in our living room, and when that love duet, what can I say? It just slays me. I mean, it's hard to hear it really delivered, but it just gets right to my soul. And I love every note of the opera, even if the storyline gets a little problematic that's present day. I look at it much more of a metaphorical or allegorical view, which is the way I view most operas. It's something very primal and very allegorical. So I don't really get caught up in these debates about cultural appropriation or whatever it is. It doesn't bother me.
It's human. Every
exactly.
person of every color can play every role, in my view.
I really think so too.
That's it. Did you, as a 6-year-old, ever aspire to play Butterfly's Child, Trouble, Dolore?
No, but my sister did. My sister played Trouble. Yeah.
Really?
Well, no, there's a funny story about that, but I won't bore you with it. She was cast to play Trouble, and then she was Trouble, and she refused.
Now, it troubles me that the translation of the name of that character, in Italian, it's dolore, which is pain or
Was
suffering.
that true? Is that right?
And I've never known why they translate dolore as trouble.
That's a good question.
Yeah, Isaac Bashevis Singer would have translated Surus, but but I have issues. Maybe, I don't know. I'll have to look. The original story by David Belasco, which he wrote in English, based on a French story before it. Maybe he called the character Trouble,
Yeah,
and it
perhaps.
got translated to Italian as dolore, pain or suffering, but in English is called Trouble.
That could
This
be.
is what we opera people lose sleep over. Now I have to learn it. If Brian, next time you see Brian, ask him if he knows, please, and let me know. And finally, Bach, St. Matthew Passion.
Yes. So when I was a sophomore in college, we had a very inspiring choral director named Lee Spear. I don't know what happened to him, but he was one of these guys who was very, very intensely in love with Bach. And I think we spent like the whole semester learning this. And once or twice a week, it was such a refuge for me. I was singing baritone in the choir. I couldn't believe how cathartic it was, and how beautiful it was to my ears. And I was definitely on that list because it was very transcendent. It was a lesson to me that the music can have really an overpowering, very powerful effect in your life. It can be salvation in a sense, very cathartic for me. And it is a masterpiece, you have to admit.
I do.
Yeah.
Do you think one has to be religious to get deep into something like that? Or be of the religion that this narrates?
That's funny because Lee Spear, our director, gave us that speech quite a few times. We all come from different religious backgrounds, faith or no faith. This is a lamentation for the disaster that human beings have made of the world. He's talking about Christ on the cross, but you can be thinking of the destruction of the planet, the children who are murdered in war, all the terrible things that man has created in the world. And you can still ask for forgiveness to whatever it is. Forgive us for making this mess. And it's so far out of our control. All we can do is lament. And that, I just see it as one giant lament for all the mess we've made. Does that make sense to you?
It does.
Yeah.
In the 2012 Verbier Festival season, I was one of the artists in residence. Among the others were Thomas Allen, Ilyana Kotrubash, Anushka Shankar, wonderful pianist himself, Alfred Brendel, fantastic pianist, and the bass baritone Thomas Kwastov.
Wow.
And we all got to do different things with audiences and with young artists. But then I was asked to sit in conversation with each one of those people, apart from Alfred Brendel. Unfortunately, he was not free. But when I spoke with Thomas Kwastov, I knew that he's an atheist. And I asked him about how he sings these great Bach oratorios with the religious implication. And he said to me, I play it as an operatic role.
Mm-hmm.
He said, because I don't connect to a lot of the things that you just described, Ben. And I think he found it hypocritical, whatever he found that to be. Because of the particular experiences of his life, he has little truck for religion. He doesn't find solace in it. And therefore, he admires the music. He admires the drama of the stories. And for him, he tells it as a role.
Yeah. And that makes sense because in any role you play, you're obviously not subscribing to the point of view of your character. You're bringing yourself to that character.
Yeah. And that, to me, Ben, is one of the great things that I love about people like you, about creative people who create music and create things that we care about that inspire us, is art, I believe, asks us to form a bridge between the artist, the art that he or she creates, and the person who's witnessing and experiencing the art.
Sure.
And each and every person forms a different bridge, but it's a very strong, powerful bridge. And a great work of art is something that we continue to live with. It only adds to who we are. We may want to stay the same way you have, but we want to grow in other ways. And I think that, you were talking about the particular aspects of the St. Matthew Passion and the Lamentation and so on. My antidote to all of the horrors that we witness in the world is the increase of art and the increase of sharing art. That can sound very idealistic,
Yeah.
but I have genuinely witnessed on numerous occasions that art provides the kind of insight, not specific necessarily, but a kind of wisdom. And when throughout this horrible war that has been inflicted on the Ukrainians, almost every week when I greet my audience, I call out Ukrainians because it can seem so incredibly bleak.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we see Ukrainian musicians performing. We see Ukrainian ballet dancers fighting on the front lines. They bring their art with them, and I see them as cultural first responders.
Yeah.
And I see the artists being right there. When we look at, you were talking about the Odyssey before, when we look at history, we may read about this battle or that war, this head of state, or that decapitation, but our understanding of what happens is through the visual and the performing arts.
Yeah, it's quite true.
And so, my friend, I'm going to conclude by saying that you will be looked at in the future by people looking back and saying, oh, they had a sense of humor too, what with all the dolore, all the suffering that was happening in our times.
Well, it's, I think of art as, what's worthwhile in this life to pursue. Obviously helping other people, saving people, giving of yourself to make the world better. But beyond that, it's having some cathartic expression. Whether you achieve any kind of level of expertise or greatness is kind of beside the point. You're opening your heart and mind through the arts. There's no other better way to do that. That's
what I meant before when I said, when I'm in front of audiences, I hear the applause, but it doesn't quite penetrate. Does it for you?
I think we're all susceptible to a little flattery every once in a while, but I like to think that I'm working. I'm trying to make things that I want to experience myself and hope that other people can share in them. That kind of thing.
I think in my experience, when I'm on the stage, I know when people are moved. Mm-hmm. You can feel, I hate the word, but it's true. You can feel the energy in the room.
Yeah, absolutely.
I've known of times when I felt out of sorts. When I remember once in Dallas many years ago, I felt out of sorts. Let's leave it at that. But something about my particular energy or not feeling right created an impression on people that people still 35 years later say to me, I saw you in Dallas and I have never forgotten it. And that's a reason for getting up and doing at a time when one can be very despondent. And this is not just in the creative arts, although it certainly is, but in the medical arts and the emotional arts and the healing arts, in the legal arts, there is such a thing, working for good. And if people would attach art to what they do, there is a wonderful cookbook by Pellegrino Artusi, one of the foundational books of Italian cuisine, called Art and Science in the Kitchen. And to me, he, with that title, encapsulated in about 1890 what happens in the kitchen. It's an admixture of art and of science.
Yeah.
And I know there's science in composing a song and there's art in composing a song. And both go together.
That's for sure.
So Ben Moore, did I leave anything out?
There's always more, but this was wonderful, Fred. It was, it's great. It's great to speak with you. You and I are both Renaissance men, so we have endless topics we could go into. But
If you say so.
yeah, but I hope to catch you in person sometime.
That
We'll
would be
discuss
great.
everything.
Keep up your wonderful work that I've admired for a very long time. I've never had the chance to speak to you at length the way we did today.
That is very true.
And I'm grateful for that. And I thank you, and my best to Brian Ziegler as well.
I'll tell
And
him.
I'll see you in the theater.
Sounds good. Sounds good.
Take care.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, Ben.